I believe it is safe to say that in life, everyone has currency. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, I don't have a lot of currency. I have a couple dollars, a couple $100, whatever the case is. I have a certain amount of currency. Now, an example of currency they just gave was dollar. The dollar is a form of currency. Another form of currency is the yen. It's not worth as much as a dollar. Or we have the pound. There's many different forms of currency. Now, I'm going to put three men onto the screen. I want you to look at them. So on the farthest left, we have Tom Holland. In the middle, we have Chris Pratt. And on the farthest right, for those of you who do not know, his name is Dick Van Dyke. And the name's is actually on the screen. So I don't really know why I said that. Anyways, so with these three men, they all had currency in their lives and still do. Now, one of the currencies we'll think of naturally is the dollar, monetary currency. Now, there's many types of currency, but the type of currency that I'll talk about is a currency that most of us probably never think about actually being a currency, and that is time. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, what? Time isn't a currency. Well, time has a worth. You have a certain amount of time, you spend your time. I'd say it's a currency. Now, like most currencies, there's a certain amount of time that matters. Like an hour. An hour usually matters to most people. Types of currency that in time that don't matter is a second or a minute. You may be thinking, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. A minute and a second aren't worth that much. But how much is a second or minute worth? Now, you probably have never thought about this, but what is time worth? Because you have hours, days, weeks, years. You don't really have a set number of how much your time is worth. Because, like other currencies, it fluctuates. Now, it usually fluctuates to do with what you are doing. So, I'm going to give a couple of examples of amount of time that truly matters, at least to the government it does, and that is hours. So, when you think of an hour, you think of being paid per hour. So, how much is an hour worth? Well, let's look at this first idea, and that is you just got hired at your local fast food chain and you are a 16-year-old, you make $14.50 an hour. Cool. Your hour is now worth $14.50. Okay, let's say you bust your butt and you work to get your doctorate and you work at a hospital, you would make around $140 an hour. Well, you could make around $140,000, $140 an hour. So if you're a doctor, your hour could be worth $140. Now, I'm going to use our army as an example, but the average US Army soldier makes around $8.64. So the Army soldier's hour is worth $8.64. Okay, well, this is interesting. The doctor makes the most money for his hour because he's a doctor. He makes a lot of money because he put in a lot of work. The 16-year-old at McDonald's, or really any fast food chain, I'm just going to pick McDonald's because most people know what McDonald's is making a solid $14.50 an hour. But the guy who's risking his life possibly is making $8.64 an hour. Do you see the problem here? The amount of time is the same, but the pay and how much the time is worth fluctuates like crazy. So the 16-year-old is making more money than the guy who is about to fight in a war. And the doctor is making more money than the 16-year-old. Which is obvious because the more time you work, the more money you should make. But it's weird because we don't really have time and how much time is worth. Because an hour can be worth so many different things to so many different types of people or people in general. So, even though the hour isn't worth the same, there's something that we can know how to spend, and that is our time. Because the 16-year-old spends his time at McDonald's, the older fellow spends his time in the hospital, and the guy in the military spends his time, obviously, in the military. Now, what exactly are we supposed to do with this? Because we have time, yeah, but what do we do with it? How do we spend our time? Now, that is a question that many people probably think about often. When am I going to do this? When am I going to do this? And you really have to choose when. So, what you also have to choose is what. The when and the what with time. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, why does this matter for this message of sorts? That is simply the Bible tells us about time. And it tells us where certain things belong in our time. So, if you would, please open your Bible or Bible app or whatever you have to Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8. Now, I'll have it on the screen if you need it, so don't worry. Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 states this: For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. So, what do we do with this? There's something that I think we often forget, and that is we don't have endless time. And the Bible shows us that there are certain times for certain things. Now, you're all very smart people, so you're easily able to tell that every verse gave us basically two examples: time to do something and time to do something else. Now, the Bible dictates what we have options to do. So, I'm going to go over all of these, and some of them I'll have points on. Some of them I won't have as many points on because they're pretty self explanatory. So, let's begin. So, to begin with, we have a time for birth and a time for death. That's pretty clear. There's a time where we'll be born, and there's a time where we will inevitably die. Now, these two things are very important because there's a time for both of these things. There'll be time where we'll see the birth of greatness and of great people who we will love, and there'll sadly be times where people who we love will die because that is the way life works after the fall. So, the second example the Bible gives us is there's a time to plant and there's a time to pluck what has been planted. So, most people call this harvesting, and that's why I have it on the screen for you as harvest. So, I'm not a farmer. I will never claim to be. I am really bad with plants, but I know some people are, so I'll try to give you justice. So, there is obviously a time to plant things. There's a time to plant your vegetables or your flowers or whatever you plant, and there's a time to harvest. Now, if you were to plant in a time that wasn't meant for planting, then your plants would probably die or just never grow. And if you were to harvest in a time where you're not supposed to harvest, then you really have nothing to harvest. So that's pretty clear. There's a time to do both things. Moving on, there's a time to kill and there is a time to heal. Now, killing is wrong, but there are some times where killing needs to happen, such as in war. But there's also times where healing needs to happen, like if you're sick or if you need rest, you will heal. Moving on, there's a time to break down and there's a time to build up. There are sometimes just times where you really just need to take a break and vent to something or someone and just get everything out of your mind. But there's also times to build up. Help those who are in those times and help them and build them up and make them feel better or just make them understand what it's really all meaning. Try helping. There's times for all things. So, these next two I'm going to group together because I think of them often together, and that is there's a time for weeping, and there's time for laughing, and there's a time for mourning, and there's a time for dancing. The reason why I put these two things together is simply because we often put together weeping and mourning, and we often put together laughing and dancing. Now, I may be wrong, but that's what I do. I'm sorry. It's my video. You can't really stop me. Anyways, but when we think about weeping and mourning, now, this may just be with me and my friends and people who I know, but often mourning and weeping isn't really a thing you do with other people or really in public. You do it by yourself in your room or wherever it may be. And you'll be happy around your friends and your family and your loved ones. That's just sometimes how it goes because it just does. But I think there's often a trap for the people who I know who are close to me and for myself personally, and that is time to weep and to mourn over something or someone that I lost that is very important because I think, okay, I'll just man up and get through it. And often for the men who I know and myself, keeping the emotions in is something that we do to make ourselves feel like we have everything under control. We are the ones people can look to if anything goes bad. But truly, what's happening on the inside is not good for us because we're not supposed to not deal with these things. And it's a trap often that we fall into that is we can't do it. But it's the exact opposite. We can do that because in the Bible, we are given the perfect example, and that example is Jesus. Jesus is the perfect example for every human being on earth because Jesus himself was a human being. So, since Jesus was perfect, everything he did was perfect. So, we should do what Jesus did. Now, I'm not sure about you, but if you ever been around people who know their Bible facts or Bible trivia, if you were to ask them, is the shortest verse in the Bible? Some of them might be able to say, oh, that's easy. It's John 11:35. Now, before I entered the 8th grade, I never really read this verse or knew anything about this verse until teachers would ask, what is everyone's favorite verse? Or what is a verse everybody knows? And they'd usually say, oh, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believed in him shall not perish and have everlasting life. That's a very popular one. But there's another very popular verse that most people knew, and that was John 11:35. And I wondered, okay, why do people know this verse? And it is simply because, first of all, it's the shortest verse of the Bible, and it's just two words. Jesus wept. Previously said, Jesus did no wrong. So everything Jesus did is to be imitated. And we can see in John 11:35 that Jesus, he wept. He mourned. He was sad because of the loss of Lazarus. Now, I'm not sure if anyone here has lost someone, but personally in my life I have lost people and I've been sad and I've had to deal with it my own way and not everybody's ways is the exact same because as stated last week, no two people are the same. But weeping and mourning is a part of life. We often push it under the rug thinking, ah, well, I'll do that eventually, ha ha ha, and get on with our day. And we have to be the person who is always laughing or always smiling or always being there for everyone. But sometimes you just need to mourn and weep and truly deal with your emotions the way you're supposed to. But also, on the opposite side, we're supposed to laugh and dance and be merry and be happy. But we need to remember that life is not only laughing and dancing. Also, life is not only mourning and weeping. But we can find times for both things because that is what we have. We have time. We choose whether or not we're going to do these things. But we also need to remember that doing these things are important. This next example that the book of Ecclesiastes gives us, I really don't have a lot to say about it because, to be quite frank, I don't know a whole lot about it because I would just read it literally, and that is casting stones and gathering stones. Like, there's a time to throw stones and there's time to gather stones. Now, most people don't do this, and I don't know exactly what the Bible means here, so I'm not really going to talk about it because I don't really know, and I shouldn't say something, and I don't want to say something that might be wrong. Not that I'm in fear of being wrong, but I don't want to give you information that is faulty because that isn't okay for me to do, and really, this is not okay. So, if you have an idea, or even if you know what on earth gathering stones and casting stones means in the context of the Bible, I would love for you to share because I honestly don't know. So, moving on, there is a time for embracing and there's a time to refrain from embracing. Now, once again, this is pretty self exclamatory. It's time to embrace, it's time to not. There's not much else to say. You all know this. There's a time to seek and there's a time to lose. Once again, pretty self explanatory. There's a time for both things. Both things are important. Once again. The next example that the book of Ecclesiastes gives us is a time to keep and there is a time to cast away. Now, this example is one I actually want to get into a little bit because I'm not sure about you guys, but for me, I am not really a hoarder per se. I'm not someone who says, "Oh, I need to keep this no matter what for prosperity's sake." There are things I will keep for prosperity's sake, but sometimes you need to cast things away. Now, whether that be addictions or things of that sort, great. It's good that you cast that away. But there's also times where you have to keep things. There's just some things where you need to keep, or sometimes keep to yourself. But the way I look at this passage is simply we in life have things, whether it be monetary or materialistic or people, that we have the wonderful ability to be able to keep it or them. And sadly, there are times where you have to cast them away or cast it away, whether that be, once again, monetary, physical, or things of that matter, or ideas or spiritual beliefs that we need to keep or cast away because that's just a part of life. That's another way to spend our time, is keeping things or casting things away. Moving on, there's a time to tear and there's a time to sow. Now, most of us do not sow. I know I don't. If you do, that's really cool. I'm proud of you. Great. I don't have the patience for sowing personally, but if you do, good for you. But there's a time to tear and there's time to sow. Now we may be thinking, okay, is what does this have to do with anything? And that is because there's not really often applicable time for us to tear something, at least not in where I live personally. But in the Bible times, they had what was considered a sackcloth, where you would put on a sackcloth after you tear your clothes in great sadness. And there's a time to do that, and there's a time to sew. There's time to mend what has been torn. Moving on, there's a time to keep silent, and there's a time to speak. Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but when I was little, I heard the phrase, if you don't have anything good to say about something or someone, don't say it. Now, your parents probably just said that to you because you were probably being rude, or you weren't being nice, or you're being mean to a friend, and they didn't want you to be mean to that person. So, there's a time to not say anything, and there's a time to speak out and speak up against it. Now, for some people, that's harder said than done. For others, it's not. But remember, there are times for both things. So sometimes, if you're thinking that thing that you shouldn't say, here's a solution: don't say it. Furthermore, we are told that there is a time to love and that there is a time to hate. Now, you should not hate people. That's not okay. That's not what we should do as people. We should be loving and kind, but we shouldn't love their actions. The Bible tells us to love the sinner, but hate the sin. Hate what they are doing, but not who they are. Because we are told to love everyone, because we are children of love, because the God of the Bible and the God of the universe is the God of love. We are clearly shown this by the aforementioned John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So, there's a time to love, and there's a time to hate. We shouldn't love everything, and we shouldn't hate everything. And finally, the book of Ecclesiastes ends this part of the passage with there's a time for war, and there's a time for peace. Now you may be thinking, war's bad. Why would there be a time for war? Now, I would very much agree with you. War is bad. But sometimes war needs to happen. And that is if someone or something is being threatened and nothing can be done about it. Peace can't be made, so sometimes you just have to have war. It's a very sad reality that we live in, but it is sadly the truth. Guys, I have a very important question for you to answer. What do you want to do with your time? Now, this is a question that I can't answer for you. That is all up to you. But I did just bring you through the first 8 verses in the third chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. This segment showed us what we could spend our time on. And you may be thinking, okay, well, I know my options, I know what I can do, but how much more of this precious time do I have left? And you may be thinking, well, I'm a young high school or college or just out of college person, so I probably have a couple years left. But I hate to break it to you. Tomorrow is sadly not a guarantee. And you may be thinking, well, that got really dark. But I think it's something that we really need to think about because we waste a lot of time. And I see that from personal experience. I have procrastinated so much in my life, and a lot of you probably have also. But we need to remember that we don't have tomorrow. But you may be asking yourself, well, how do you know that? As it is shown in Psalm 90, verse 12, this. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Now, you may be thinking, well, number your days. That is simply be grateful for the days that you have, because you don't know how many more you have left. So please, 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 don't waste your time. It is never promised. And with all those options you were given in the third chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, make sure you make the right decision in whatever you do, because it is a decision that you'll never get back, because you can't return time. I'm sorry, you can't. But you can always spend your time in a way that honors and pleases the Lord. But once again, I stress, do not waste time. It is a very, very precious currency, and it is never promised. Thank you.